Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jago Dodson. I'm the chair of the Urban Futures Graduate Research Symposium for 2023, which is on top of my usual role as the director of the Centre for Urban Research here at RMIT University. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the peoples of the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose lands RMIT conducts its business, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia where the university conducts its business. And I guess in the context of the conversation we're having this afternoon, also note that First Nations people have been innovating and adapting within the context of the Australian climate and landscape on country for thousands and thousands of years. So the Graduate Research Symposium is an event or a set of events that happen throughout the year at RMIT, where we bring together HDR candidate milestones as part of an intensive week-long kind of event, and we add to them plenary sessions with keynotes such as the talk today, methodological workshops, showcase workshops about the work that's going on in urban futures at RMIT. So as part of the week, I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this keynote session with Professor Rob Raven from Monash University, looking at sustainability transitions and urban experimentation. Rob is an internationally renowned researcher on sustainability transitions. He's also a professor of sustainability transitions in his formal role at Monash University, and he's also the deputy director of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. So sustainability and transitions, he's the person to have talk about those. And he also has a very long record of research into the experimental dimensions of sustainability transitions, including within cities. And obviously the city's focus is a really important dimension of the urban futures framing for the Graduate Research Symposium. So I'll hand over to Rob in a moment. Rob will talk for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have some questions, and then there'll be the opportunity for a bit of conversation afterwards over lunch. I'd also just like to mention hello to all the people who are online. If you do have questions at the end, please pop them into the chat. I think there's a chat function, and we'll try and pick those up as part of the conversation. So I guess welcome, Rob, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thanks, and thank you everyone else for coming here today, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to talk here, and I actually don't say often yes to keynotes invitations. They're quite, you have to prepare for them. It's a lot of work, and then but once in a while I'll do it, and it offers really great reflection to think about where you actually have been taking your research over the last 2 or 3 decades or so. So really pleased to talk about that, and invite you all for discussion afterwards, or feel free to come to me at another time if you don't have enough time after this one. So I've got quite a few slides to go through, so I'll try and speed up a little bit in the beginning, so I got a bit more time at the ending, but let's see how far we can get. So title of today is Sustainability Transitions and Urban Experimentation, as Jake already alluded to. I've been investigating the topic of experimentation for about 2 decades or more now, and I've been able to sort of approach the topic from various angles, and it has taken me into various types of disciplinary fields and domain-related topics. So you see various examples coming through in this talk, which none of them I'm really an expert in. So please bear with me if I say things that you don't agree with. So just briefly on my background, I do have an interdisciplinary training. I started out as an electrical engineer, but sort of turned into a social scientist through my Master Science and my PhD. To paraphrase Mans Nielsen, who's the director of the Stockholm Environment Institute, I'm sort of still recovering from being trained as an engineer originally. But it has given me, I guess, this sort of problem-solving orientation, which I still sometimes find useful, and it's also useful to be able to actually have meaningful conversations with engineers, because lots of the stuff that we study in our research is done by engineers. I became a professor in 2014 at Utrecht University in the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development, which was also an interdisciplinary position. And then in 2018, I moved to MSDI. So mostly my interest is in the role of experimentation and urban experimentation, and I've looked at various topics, in the beginning predominantly in energy, but then moved into more cities-oriented stuff, which took me into cycling, nature-based solutions, and more recently also circular economy. So you see various examples coming through in the talk today. So I want to go back a little bit to experimentation and sustainability transitions and what they are sort of from a academic perspective. But first, let me say that experimentation is not just an abstract notion that we like to think about in our academic work. It's actually something that's happening on the ground. And here are some of the examples of studies that have looked into experiments across the globe. So there's a paper by Harry Bulkley and Vanessa Castambrodo, who looked at 627 urban climate change experiments globally. So these are urban actors that are really trying to do things differently in their cities to deal with the challenge of climate change. Another project that I was involved in myself looked at 65 solar PV photovoltaic experiments in various ways, ranging from solar cities, big solar experiments, all the way down to small-scale rooftop rural solar experiments. Another example is a project that was led by Harry Bulkley, but funded through the Horizon 2020 program in Europe, which looked at nature-based solutions. Again, large number of experiments that particularly urban actors are putting up to use nature in a way to deal with climate-related challenges. And we looked in this case around at 520 experiments, which was part of a database of 1,000 experiments with nature-based solutions. And finally, a project we're currently working in is together with Megan Farrelly and Ricky Valley at Monash University, which is looking at experimentation in water and energy domains and doing some comparative analysis, again, using a database approach next to qualitative case studies to try and understand what are the place-based patterns and factors in experimentation and how do they scale into becoming influential in, for instance, policy-making processes. So experimentation is also a very diverse phenomenon, right? So here are just 3 examples from a book that we published in 2016, The Experimental City. One example is the Princess Inn Garden in Berlin, which is often well recognized. It's really sort of a social, bottom-up driven experimental effort by citizens to engage differently with food consumption, food production in very much an urbanized environment. So this comes with all sorts of things like, identities, values, people engaging in new ways with each other, rediscovering their neighbors, very much a social innovation project. Another example is in the case of Delhi in India, where the state government set up an experiment to replace fossil fuel-driven rickshaws with e-rickshaws. Again, experimental, there wasn't really proper infrastructure. Rickshaw drivers needed to learn how to use these e-rickshaws differently. There were all sorts of legal issues in terms of norms and standards that had been embedded but developed for fossil fuel-based rickshaws, etc. And then you've got the massive, large-scale master eco-city type of experiments. Still very much an experiment, but the scale of an entire city. So how do you build a city that is more or less zero carbon, produces 50% less waste, and is very efficient in its water use? So very different kinds of experiments, very different kind of dynamics, very different kind of actors that are involved and that initiate these experiments. Universities are also very much experimental actors, and many of you, including myself, are based at universities. So for universities, experiments often are expressed through the notion of living labs. One of my colleagues just finished a report, Paris Hatfield, which looked at 18 university living labs around the world, looking at how universities trying to be more experimental in taking the research out of the lab and actually doing it in a particular place, often at their own campuses, but also in collaboration with cities or in other places, and just trying out new stuff. And this can be technology-related stuff, but it can also be sort of behavioral interventions or health-related interventions. At Monash, we're trying to currently think about doing living labs in a better way and developing support structures, because it's extremely difficult to do a living lab in sort of siloed university structures. So as part of that, we now have identified 20 ongoing Monash living labs, ranging from sort of more controlled environments to very open environments, and more technology-driven focus to more social science-driven focus. And I just quickly looked over the RMIT lab side. RMIT is also doing living labs as well. So, and these are just some of the examples of what universities are doing in this. So now, to briefly explain our take on understanding and positioning experimentation. And there's quite a lot of diverse writings around experimentation, but my perspective really comes from a socio-technical perspective. And to explain this, I'll quickly talk you through an example of sort of individual car-based mobility as a socio-technical system. So the car obviously is in the middle, and it's the most obvious artifact if you go out in the street. It's cars that you see, right? But to be able to drive from A to B, you need a whole socio-technical system around it. Right? You need there's an industry structure. If your car breaks down, you can bring it in for repair. You know, we've developed certain preferences and how we use our cars. We've developed identities often around around freedom. So there's a sort of culture and symbolic meanings attached to it. If you don't have enough money, the bank knows what it's funding. If you want to buy a car, and so on. And then, of course, there's a whole range of technical knowledge that makes these cars so efficient and comfortable, and that has developed over the last more than 100 years. So you can imagine when you start thinking about a different urban mobility system, which is no longer centered about private cars, but is centered perhaps around a combination of active transport, electric vehicles, bus rapid transit, or other public transport systems, walking. That means it's not just a simply replacement of a car by something else, but it's really rethinking and redesigning the entire system that makes current car-based mobility so efficient and comfortable. So that means a transitions perspective means really thinking about how do you get from one situation where the whole system is organized around a particular car, about a particular artifact, and institutionalized in rules and institutions and practices, to another one. So that's what we call, and the other one is more sustainable. Right? We do this because we are oriented towards trying to overcome the negative impacts that our car-based dependency creates for cities and for societies, not the least climate change. So this is what we call sustainability transitions, long-term, multidimensional and fundamental transformations of large socio-technical systems towards more sustainable modes of production and consumption. So some characteristics, I see that some of the references are dropping off. I'm happy to share my slides. It has all the references at the end of it, if you like to. So some of the characteristics of sustainability transitions, they are multidimensional, so they go beyond technology and infrastructure and include culture and behavior and social norms and policies and so on. And these dimensions, they co-evolve in relation to each other. So it's not that we suddenly had a car-based system, right? But it co-evolved, all the institutions and infrastructures co-evolved alongside the development of our cars, and our behaviors and expectations developed around that. That makes them very pet dependent as well. So there are long-term processes. Transitions have been studied in the past that can easily take up to 50 years. I always give the example of solar energy, which is now commonplace, not the least also in Australia, where many people have solar panels. But this started in basically the 1970s and even earlier. So we've seen 50 years of development to get to a point where even solar energy is still just a very marginal part of our energy production system. So these transformations take a lot of time. Obviously, multi-reactor processes, including many different kinds of vectors, and this also gives rise to contestations and ambiguities and disagreements, because in the present, there's multiple and plural futures possible in that transformational processes. So this gives rise to contestation and disagreement, and I'll come back to that in the later slide. That also means that transition governance or transition management approaches need to acknowledge this existence of contestation and ambiguity. We cannot wish that away. Stability and change, it's the interplay between innovation and path dependency, and there's often an important role for public policy in sustainability transitions because they're often public goal-oriented processes. So this is one of the models that I won't go into detail. If if you are familiar with transitions thinking, then this is a well-known model. It used to be sort of the dominant model. By now, we have many different kinds of thinkings about how transitions evolve and how they could potentially be steered and guided. But this is just to indicate that most of what I will be talking about is that level of niches and experimentation. So these are within this particular perspective, the socio-technical perspective on transitions, is where new stuff is developed and can scale and grow and start to become influential within that dominant socio-technical regime or socio-technical systems. And this model also says that this is only possible if there are particular windows of opportunity, which puts sufficient pressure on regimes or systems to open up. So this model has been used in various ways. It's been critiqued, it's been adapted, it has been nuanced, which I can't go into at this particular stage, but it still forms, I guess, a particular ontology of how to look and understand at transition processes. So what is experimentation then? So I just want to highlight here that there's at least two different ways of understanding and looking at experimentation. So the one that's often emphasized in transition research is that experimentation really is a mechanism to nurture and grow radical innovations. Innovations that are radically different from the incumbent, the norm, the incumbent perspective, with a view to influence those system-level transformations towards sustainability. There's also, particularly within urban research, experimentation, and this goes back to some of the work, for instance, like Harriet Bilke. She would emphasize that experimentation is very much a governance response from urban actors who find themselves within this challenging environment where they see the issues around climate change and other large-scale societal challenges. And it's really a pragmatic governance response to say, well, let's experiment. We get stuck in these institutions, we get stuck in these planning procedures. Let's leave that aside for a second and start experimenting with new things and learn about how we can govern ourselves into a more sustainable future. And based on a literature review, we also developed a particular definition across various parts of the literature, which I think is still very useful. I think it really highlights the most important things that experimentation is about. If I would write the definition again, I would probably put in some reference to place-basedness, because experiments are very much place-based initiatives, which is not included in this particular definition. So I'm going to briefly talk you through some of the origins of where experimentation in the context of sustainability transitions comes from. And this was mostly formulated initially in a perspective called strategic niche management. So this goes back to the mid-1990s, where increasingly it was recognized that things like trying to do better environmental innovation wasn't enough. We really had to think about how innovation and environmental innovation happens in the context of these pet-dependent systems and regimes. And in order to do that, and through historical research, insights emerged that often these more radical alternatives, they emerge in niches, right? So niches are, for instance, like take the example of solar energy again. Solar energy was initially, if you would say in the 1970s, in the Netherlands, where I'm from originally, that you wanted to do research on solar energy, people would tell you, well, the sun never shines in the Netherlands. Why do you want to do research on solar energy? So interested actors, proponents of solar energy, they had to take their work through things like, offshore locations where they could test and trial because there wasn't an infrastructure, and solar energy started to make sense there. Or they took their work to developing countries in Africa where it made sense because there wasn't an infrastructure. So these you could say are geographical niches which provided an initial test bed for developing alternatives to the incumbent system of fossil fuel energy generation systems. So strategic niche management built upon and tried to develop a governance or management perspective, saying that we can actually also try and create these niches, right? Maybe through government policy. We can temporarily create protected spaces, seedbeds of innovation, where we can then nurture and grow alternatives to this incumbent system. So just highlight a couple of words here that have formed sort of the key, the key underpinnings of this perspective. It's controlled. So it's not entirely happening so it's a controlled, deliberate attempt, would be probably a better word. Protected spaces, so these are spaces that offer some type of protection against incumbent selection pressures. It's about experimentation, it's about learning, and there's been a strong emphasis on technology. in this particular perspective. And this has also been criticized later on that experimentation is not necessarily technology related. Won't go into depth, too much detail here, but what this perspective is based in is evolutionary thinking. Obviously, the notion of niches is an evolutionary concept. And from that, biological evolution is very much a generic theory of change, which happens to have been discovered in the context of biology, or has been articulated in the context of biology. But the general thinking of how evolution is a driver in change can be applied, has been applied also to things like technological change. So this is, variation then means things like innovation through research and development. Selection means new artifacts, new innovations are selected by markets, by policy regulations, by culture, by preferences of end users. And retention means that once these innovations become embedded in all of this, these institutions and preferences adapt to it. So again, that provides the retention of these innovations in a set of institutions and rules. That's sort of a bit of a mechanistic kind of thinking, which has been underpinning it. Science and technology studies provide a lot more insights in terms of the roles of actors and agencies in undertaking this process. And the notion of quasi-evolutionary theory was introduced, noting that within technological change, variation is not a random process as it is in biology. It's actually actors with intentions that create certain variations, anticipating what the future is or should be. So that's why it's quasi-evolutionary. And then history of technology, as I said before, provided a lot of examples of transitions in the past and niche innovations. So what happens then within niches? What are the key processes? Why are they important mechanisms in enabling transformations? First of all, they bring together actors. They can give rise to new social networks that are broad and deep and that become advocates of a particular alternative. They also help to test, explore, couple expectations about what the future is. Often experiments are being set up by high expectations. Now, this is a general dynamic you would see with AI or with electric vehicles. They come with very high expectations that then turn into promises, and they become requirements. Once they got funded, they become requirements, and that needs to be tested in these experiments, and then they fail. It's a famous hype cycle dynamic. And then, of course, they facilitate learning. So at least that's what they should do. What we find in some of the projects I'll talk later about is that learning is actually something that's often not deliberately managed and organized in experiments, which is really a great challenge to move beyond the experimentation phase. So a whole bunch of research has been done on niches and experimentation, and then this book was published, which came out of the European funded research project, which looked at electric vehicles and experimentations and demonstrations with them. And they basically, based on that research, concluded that up until that point, research has been far too optimistic about what experimentations can do. They don't change regimes over time. They don't change systems over time. So that started to shift the agenda, the research agenda, into a perspective where we actually need to start looking and understanding at how portfolios of experiments over time start to build up what we call a global level. And this is the local level of experimentation. So these are the individual experiments which generate lessons which can be aggregated into sort of generic frameworks or theories or policy approaches. And that can then inform new experiments. So, and then eventually sort of a proto-regime might emerge out of all of that experimentation, which then, that in itself, this is also where intermediary actors or peak bodies play an important role. Right? So they can start to become more influential in trying to change the wider institutional environment through which then these experiments become influential. So this shifted the attention in research and also in policy to sort of programs of 10 to 15 years, experimental programs of 10 to 15 years. And in my PhD thesis, I studied at the time a program that the Danish government had established around particular energy technologies, particularly biogas, and that still is a really great example. They didn't talk about transitions, but it's still a really great example of how a government-led transition program really enabled an expansion of a renewable energy technology within a national system. So then there's this other literature. So this whole sort of technology-focused literature it's relevant and interesting, but it sort of forgot about all of those initiatives that are happening outside of the formal spheres of government and industry, where, like, remember the Princess Inn Garden in Berlin, where ordinary people, civil society, citizens start doing things differently themselves. The UK has had a transition time movement, which I think is still there, but it's spread out, which is another example of how ordinary people start to engage with issues around climate change or the environment, or maybe now sort of the repair movement is another example. So how do we make sense of that from an experimentation perspective? And Jill Fang and Adrian Smith from the UK, they've done quite interesting work on that, and started to sort of position the two, sort of the market-based, market-led innovations in relation to what they call grassroots innovation. It's a really interesting line of research that came out of that. So I'll now talk about a number of elaborations. So this is sort of really the basis from which various research streams emerged that looked into different aspects of experimentation. The first one I want to talk about is the underlying politics. So, and much of the initial work in, I guess, in transition thinking and experimentation was quite instrumental. And it forgot about the underlying politics and issues of power that are there, right? So if you're developing an alternative, and whether that's in food or whether that's in mobility or whether that's in any other domain in the circular economy, you're facing this incumbent socio-technical system, which is not a system of institutions and materialities, it's also a system of power. People in powerful positions, they have control of what kind of decisions are being made in terms of what kind of programs are being funded, what kind of programs are being ignored, who is allowed to participate in these innovation trajectories, who's not allowed, who's excluded. So this is where the political aspects start to come in. And together with Adrian Smith and colleagues, Florian Kern and Van Verhees, it's a cross-national research project funded through both the UK and the Dutch National Science Foundations. We started to look at protection as something that is political. And we started to make a distinction between what we call inward-oriented work and outward-oriented socio-political work. So if you remember this graph there, sort of you've got the experiments going on in local places, and then you've got this sort of more global level of intermediary organizations, networking organizations that are also trying to win new resources into that emerging, evolving niche of experimentations. That's really socio-political work. And we studied a whole bunch of cases, particularly in the energy domain, wind energy, solar energy, carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, and try to identify, particularly from a narrative perspective, what are these actors doing? And we sort of made a dichotomy in terms of two types of narratives that are being talked about by advocates. So one is a fit and conform narrative, which really says, look, don't worry, these experiments, these innovations that we're working on, it's not going to change, it's not going to disrupt the system. Just give us a little bit of money and we make it efficient enough and comfortable enough so that it really smoothly fits into the dominant system. Right? And that's sometimes a clever thing to do. If you're facing an incumbent, who's in the position of getting benefits out of the incumbent system, you don't want to disrupt them probably too much, or they will ignore you. But there's also the stretch and transform one, which is much more driven often by grassroots organizations, for instance, which are saying, look, the underpinning problem is not your technological system, it's really we need different values. We need start to make really different sense of how we understand what mobility is, what food is, and how we are destroying our environment through this. And therefore we need an entirely different system. But that's much more a stretch and transform, which emphasizes institutional reform. In reality, you always see these kind of narratives and everything in between happening all at the same time, which again makes it political. But this was a way to try and sort of make it make an argument that there are these diverse narratives that we need to be looking at if we are to understand why certain niche developments are perhaps more successful than others, and what kind of implications that then has for whether that's really a transformative outcome or whether that's really sort of more just an incremental business as usual outcome. So then to take that one step further is we then wanted to know a bit more about what is then the kind of work, this socio-political work that these actors are doing in these niche spaces. And this is based on a PhD thesis, Peter van Doren, who's now, I believe, working at the Dutch Environmental Assessment Agency, So she was particularly looking at the Dutch low carbon housing niche. And she looked at about 20 or so different intermediary organizations within the Dutch low carbon housing niche, and what kind of work they were doing. And we started to try and make sense and categorize the kind of work using sort of institutional work theory, which comes from neo-institutional theory, and distinguishing between political work, so influencing rules, property rights, constructing different kinds of boundaries, the technical work, including mental models, shared worldviews, and then the cultural work, which is really about stimulating common ways of acting and behaving, so things like normative social norms. And then we distinguish between sort of different kinds of contexts in which, or different kinds of efforts in which these intermediary organizations are working. So drawing on sort of that distinction between market-based innovation and grassroots-based or community-based innovation, and also drawing on the distinction between work that's more inward-oriented versus work that's more outward-oriented, so looking at regime transformation. You can start to see that these types of work are different. So in market-based innovation that's focused on niche development, it's really about visioning and coalition building. And the technical work is predominantly standardizing, theorizing, constructing learning communities. If you move into community-based innovation, then certainly that cultural pillar becomes a lot more important. So intermediary organizations would be really doing a lot more emphasis on creating new identities with these communities and within these communities that they was a part of themselves. And then moving to regime transformation and market-based innovation. So this is also starting to look at a lot more of the lobbying work that needs to be going on. So really trying to go behind the scenes, trying to get people on board of your narrative to try and influence some of the incumbents' perspectives and possibilities to influence change, as well as sort of more the demonstration element of experimentation. So it's not just about learning, but you actually want to demonstrate that something works to other people that then might become interested in that particular alternative and start investing in it. And then finally, the awareness raising activities, if these are more community-based initiatives. So the creation of new identities really is more inward-oriented. This is starting to be focused on the broader community of people that you want to convince if some of these grassroots innovation are to spread much more beyond the place than where they initially conceived. So the final aspect I want to talk about in how am I doing on time? 10 minutes? It's got to really hurry up. So it's around conflicts, which I'll just refer to this paper for further reading. I want to talk briefly about geography of experimentation. This is the other extension of literature that, or emerging research stream that came out of an experimentation focus. And basically what geography of experimentation has done is really to elaborate some of the key notions in this experimentation literature, which really draw on geographical notions such as space, scale, and place. It also talks about uneven geographies. Why do transitions or experimentations happen in one place, but not in another? And also research around an implicit assumption that transitions are national phenomena, which obviously by now we know there's been a whole bunch of research around the role of urban actors and networked cities. So that's a very different kind of geographical skill where experimentations and transitions happen. So I'm going to speed up because I won't be able to talk about the last part of my slide too much. I'm going to be selective in the ones I talk about. This one I want to briefly talk about is research coming out of the nature-based solutions project, nature-based project that we did in Europe. So this is based on an analysis of 560 or 520 experiments in 100 European cities. And what we really wanted to look into is what are those place-based factors that really shape outcomes of experimentation. So really to deep dive into the place-based aspects. And based on the literature, we identified a range of variables, if you like, that starts to say, well, depending on the policy visions of plans and existing governance and stakeholder networks and localized learning processes and so on, they all shape the degree at which experiments are more incremental or more radical, and whether they're more technical or social in nature. And then we also make a distinction between cities that are more innovative, that provide more innovative city environments than cities that are less innovative. So, and here's just some of the findings that, in more innovative city environments, there's more stakeholder diversity, and there are more non-traditional innovators, such as schools and hospitals, who were very active actors in the nature-based solution space in our database. They also, innovative cities also tend to offer a wider range of funding structures. And as I already mentioned, localized learning, strangely enough, has not been able to really, we didn't really find a lot of evidence of localized learning happening in these experiments. So the absence of evidence is not an evidence of absence, but still it is something that comes across several projects that we looked into, that localized learning is not something that happens automatically. So it needs to be organized and it needs to be funded. And this is something I keep emphasizing also in when we're trying to win new projects, is we need to fund localized learning, otherwise it won't happen. I'll skip this one as well. This is a bit of a more recent work that we've been doing in, so I'll go back to the previous one. So more recent work, we've been looking into experimentation at the scale of neighborhoods or districts or precincts. Right, so this again goes back to the idea that we need to think more sort of in terms of a portfolio approach of experimentation and larger scale experiments. And then the dynamics of experimentation change, and I'm not able to go into much detail, but that means in these kind of experimental settings at the precinct scale, we have to accept that there's a lot more ambiguity, that it's a much less controllable environment where different kinds of actors and agents come in and out, where you have to be quite strategic and opportunistic when it comes to ensuring you get funding for the next phase of transformation or the next phase of experimentation. And where learning is much more multidimensional, multi-domain focused, much more second order or reflexive, or more reflexivity is needed in these processes. So it really levels up the challenges of doing experimentation in a way that it becomes transformational. Done some work in looking into what that we're trying to propose. So we're trying to link up here with the notion of mission-oriented innovation as well, from Mariana Mazzucato. And at the same time, there's a literature out there which is around innovation districts coming out of initially the Brookings Institute, Julia Wagner and Katz. And we tried actually to say, well, actually these literatures are not in conversation at all with each other. And we think they can really have mutual benefits if you start to think about things like mission-oriented innovation districts. So how do we bring this mission-oriented thinking in conversation with a more place-based kind of thinking that's underpinning innovation districts? And so trying to make sense of this through a literature review, and it's also underpinning, in my view, some of the work that we're doing in some of our ongoing research projects, where we talk about net zero precincts, which I'll give an example about in the last couple of slides. So this is getting closer to some of my recent research interests. So as you can see, going from geography to political science to institutional theory, and more recently, I really became interested in what does that all mean for ordinary people, everyday people. And this is, I think, really a relevant stage for us to think about, because as transitions start to move into new phases, like the energy transition or the mobility transition, it's increasingly affecting all parts of our lives beyond our professional lives. So what does that mean? Like if you're not engaging with these languages or theories or policies or anxieties, what does it mean from an ordinary person living in a household, right? So this is what we tried to do. We started out with one of the review paper where we looked at different the notion of behavior, which is a contested notion because it brings with it a particular ontology and epistemology. But we did a review that you can read more about in this paper. We did also a couple of projects, and this is a project we did. This is an ASC-funded research project, which is more or less finished by now, although we still have a special issue open for this one, so if you're interested, please talk to me. But this looked at household innovation, so the role of household and household innovation in transition to low-waste living. And so why do we want to look at households? So the way we framed it in this project is that households are predominantly seen as passive subjects whose behaviors need to be changed in order to achieve like policy aspirations, right? So it's a very passive, almost like a top-down approach, which is underpinning much of the policy formulations. Also in the Australian context, we've done some policy analysis as well as part of this. So we wanted to do different things. We did a demographic study, policy study, but the key thing I want to talk about here is the household study. So this was also informed by this idea of experimentation. Now, what we wanted to do is to work with households to invite them to design their own experiments to live a low-waste life for 6 weeks. And then we would send them weekly emails and we would have workshops with them to actually understand what is that systems transformation challenge if you're just living in your own house. How does that look like? And develop the whole framework, which I can't talk to right now, but is informed by social practice theory and socio-technical systems thinking. So it's really trying to bring together this deep understanding of how behaviors are embedded within social practices and the materialities of the home and the relationships in the home, and how it's embedded and influenced by the socio-technical level of policies and infrastructures and services and businesses and so on. So these are some of the experiments that our participants came up with. Some wanted to live 100% zero waste life. Others focused on particular waste streams, zero plastic waste. Some wanted to start a garden, which you can question if that's feasible in 6 weeks' time. Some wanted to learn repair skills, repair their own bikes. And others, interestingly, started a social influencing campaign to help educate others to do the same thing. So we published a conversation article about this, but the key finding really is that within the current settings, within the current social technical systems, it's very, very difficult to live a low waste life. It's extremely difficult. And you have to remember, these are all, if you participate in an experiment like this, you are committed. You're like someone who doesn't give a S about sustainability or low waste living, that wouldn't participate. So these are committed people, and even they say it's extremely difficult to live a low waste life. It requires all sorts of extra mental capacity, time, money, and motivations. Social relationships is something that comes up a lot, both enabling and constraining. We had some people tell us that their family members told them, "Mom, you've taken us so far down this low waste living, please stop, I can't deal with it anymore." Households were very frustrated by system failure in Australia, particularly the ones that were knowledgeable about systems and systems change elsewhere. And interestingly, we also asked households what needs to change, what kind of systems change, policy change do we need to happen. And if you put that all together, it almost looks like a systems transformation approach. These households together collectively told us things like, we need to legislate end-of-life producer responsibility, we need to discourage or ban polluting products, we need financial incentives for both consumers and producers, we need reporting requirements, we need to improve recycling infrastructures, we need markets for recycled products, and so on and so forth. We need multi-level policy alignments. I think I'll manage. So this was a bit of an eye-opener for me to really start looking at systems change from an ordinary people's perspective. But the second project I briefly want to talk about is the Net Zero Precincts project, which is drawing on transition management, a transition management perspective, where you sort of do a visioning of the future system, try and do a mapping of the current system, envision the future of that system, in this case a precinct, identify particular pathways, start doing living lab experiments, and then all along the way do learning and monitoring and see what that tells us about that future net zero precinct. And the Monash Clayton campus is the case study that we are working with. So it's very much an action-based case study project. What we also do is we combine it with design anthropology, because transition management in a way is very much sort of the system thinking perspective. Design anthropology starts from completely the other way. It starts from very much experiential ways of engaging with a system, in this case the precinct. So, and it talks about things like that really matter to us. Like talks to students that are not just going to campus to get a unit and get a degree. They're living on the campus, right? They maybe have their first dates or whatever. Like it's a meaningful place. So how do you start engaging that in a transition and transformation perspective? So one of the things is that we don't worry about reading the details, but we did two things in the initial phase of the project. First, we did a framing analysis through interviews with people in the precinct and asked them, what do you think the net zero precinct is? And if you think about this, net zero precinct, that's just a precinct without emissions, right? But if you actually ask people, you get very different kind of responses. And so one is, it's about electrifying everything. Others says, no, it's really about place matters. And we really need to start thinking about the role of traditional owners and active transport and improve walkability. Others said, no, it's about going green. We need green nature-based solutions. We need, much more water-sensitive urban design, and it's about health and well-being. And then there's the group that says, it's an innovation hotspot. We want to have net zero entrepreneurs, and we need to grow the next economy. And all of that is happening at the same time. So again, it goes back to this idea that these transitions are political, and depending on the frame that people mobilize, they foreground certain futures and ignore other futures. And that is then further complicated by these ethnographic interviews, who bring in, even within these frames, who then say, well, let's electrify everything. We just give everyone sufficient access to electric vehicle charging at campus, because people park their car at campus. And then people tell me, well, actually, no, I'm a wife without a husband, and I have 3 kids, I need to take them everywhere. I don't have time to just charging at this moment in time, I need to charge it somewhere else. So these like everyday realities, they need to come into play with this sort of maybe idealized sort of framings that we find here. And we're taking this forward in a range of living lab experiments. Final slide. Just noticing that many of us are, might be working, many of you I think are PhD students. I was a PhD student myself, but also my own research project. I engage often with living lab kind of experimental kind of research designs. And here are just some of the reflections that I took from it. Experiments, in my view, like a means to research impact, right? So this is how you can think about the role of experimentation and using that in your research design of a PhD. And it's an important aspect of many research agendas. So it may also help develop a career outside of academia. You can demonstrate you not just have been sitting behind your desk, but you actually have engaged with the real world. There's multiple methodological ways of engaging with experiments. You can use it as a case study. So we sort of study a living lab at a distance. You can help design particular experiments. You can be an observer or an active participant. What's good to notice is that experiments really have their own dynamic, and they often take a lot of time to establish. And as a researcher, you don't have fully control over what happens in those experiments and when they happen. So usually I always say, well, if you are interested in action-based research, don't make that the entirety of your PhD. Make it a fraction of your PhD, and have a backup plan whenever a living lab experiment doesn't unfold for whatever reason that's beyond your control. And finally, the idea of reflexivity. So obviously, as an academic, you become an active participant in action research and living lab research. So be really clear about managing expectations of the partners that you're working with, what your role is, and also be reflexive that sometimes you are not a researcher, but you're actually trying to design and influence or manage an experiment. But then you have to put back the hat of the researcher on yourself and say, okay, but what did I just do and how did it affect others? Taking notebooks and etc. Make sure you record all of that when you go about in your research. So stop there. I'm happy to talk about any of the slides I had to skip through more quickly, or any other questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for that incredible tour of sustainability transitions thinking and research over the course of both your career and as the literature and the field has developed over the last few decades, and including under your very important influence as well. We do have some time for questions, so if anyone would like to raise a question, whether you're in the room or online, please make yourself known. And here, we've got a bit of time before we move to lunch.
Thanks, Rob. There's a heap of great stuff in there. I just was interested in any observations you have around, through all of this, if we look at the imperative of pace we need to do with so many transitions now, sustainability, energy, etc. like any kernels of like how to actually go through the barrier if we don't have much time, or to compress, you know, some people talk about compressed transformation. Just wondered if you had any observations there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so time is a tricky thing, and it's something we tend to exogenize in our thinking, and we tend to accept these narratives that we are under great pressure, which we are in climate change related narratives. At the same time, time is also an endogenous part, right? Time might not be the same, and time pressures might not be the same for actors engaging in that transition, right? So for some might say, well, we still have until 2030, that's 7 years, or we have until 2050, you know, that's, what is it, 27 years, that's a long time, right? For policymakers, that's way too long. I really cannot imagine they're just working on the next 3 years. For a researcher in a research environment, that's perfect. 27 years, you can imagine things totally different. Perfect, let's talk about 27 years. For a community actor who might be losing their jobs because coal-based jobs are phasing out in a certain region, it's a problem of today. So this time is something that we need to start endogenize, I think, in our transition governance approaches. The other part is also that transitions are also very different phases. Energy transition is the one that's very much further ahead, and where acceleration will happen. It's happening, right? So just remarkable how much add-on we get in terms of renewable energy generation each and every day. That's a result of a very long startup time since the 1970s. Other transitions are really just at the start, maybe, of that transformation. So some transformations are accelerating, others are not yet at the point where they can start accelerating. When acceleration happens, you know, there's some really good research around from Benjamin Sovacool, who looked at the pace of energy transitions, and there's some good arguments to make that, particularly in energy transitions, acceleration will go much quicker than it has been going so far, because we've had this very long build-up time. And if you look at energy transitions in the past, there are many, they tend to go quicker as they proceed. So I think there's hope for that. But yeah, my main point would be that to really think about this endogenizing time and how we engage with time, not something that's out there, but we need to start integrating in our analysis and practice of engaging with transitions.
Europe. Any more questions? Please, go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. You present your publications as a logical narrative. When did it become clear for you that this is the narrative? Are there many narratives and insights you take this one, or did you embark on your journey and solve this is the narrative?
Good question. Just trying to make sense of what I've done in the last 25 years. No, I mean, joking aside, I think it's an iterative process. So the narrative also changes. So if this talk in another 2 years, it might be slightly different. But my work has usually been organized through trying to focus on particular thematics that is also influenced by the wider academic community that I feel a part of, and vice versa. So try to influence that thinking there as well. So there's sort of a logic where I engage more with the politics of experimentation initially, and more with the geography of experimentation and institutional aspects, and now more recently with the ordinary people kind of thematic. So this is how I try and organize the kind of works that I do, and experimentation is really the thread throughout all of that. But once you find yourself in, you know, when one of these thematics end and the other one is emerging, you still don't really know where that's going to go. So for the first couple of years when I moved to Australia, I was sort of at the end of my sort of geography institutional orientation, and I sort of, what is it I'm going to do next? And it takes a bit of time to really get your head around that next phase. Yeah.
Andrew, please go ahead.
I was wondering if you might like to, thanks for the talk, by the way. I was wondering if you might like to reflect on the use of ideas like living lab and even the words and experimentation, and how you think that goes with policymakers, and whether that makes it serious, or in their mind possibly makes it seem, you know, unserious or trite, if you like. Is it a good language to use? Have we made a trap for ourselves with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the answer is that you really have to be conscious about the language around Living Lab or experimentations when you talk about different kinds of people in different kinds of environments. So Living Lab, my impression is policy actors usually kind of like it. It's not at least it's not something that sets them off. There's a question though around sort of the subjects in Living Labs. Do people want to be experimented with? In particular, if it's imposed on them without good, co-design and co-participation. I've done a little bit of research, which I didn't talk about, but some of my work has been drawing me into smart cities when that was sort of a hot thing in the public debate, and still is in some places. This sort of anonymous monitoring through all sorts of sensors in the cities, and that was often put out there as a Living Lab as well, which has been really very much criticized with all sort of normative and ethical implications. We also took the language at the moment. We are building up a program of work in Indonesia around the Citarum River program, which is the most dirtiest, apparently the most dirtiest river in the world. And we're working in local communities trying to develop what we call sort of a Living Lab type of approach to experiment with different types of waste management infrastructures, very much taking sort of a circular economy perspective, by value of those new systems are being kept locally so people benefit from them. This is a really very different kind of course, cultural situation, and it's not always helpful to talk about. So in that case, we actually sort of stay away sometimes from the language of Living Labs and experiments. Talk more about research hubs, which I kind of like, I think, more. But it's a common thing, like all these languages that we bring from our academic discourse. I still remember when we were doing a project in India and Thailand, and I was teaching a PhD workshop as well. And it was this Chinese, I'll never forget this, Chinese woman, a PhD student in the audience that was talking about regimes and dependency and stability and how that's creating all sorts of issues for change. She was nodding along and writing it, and then afterwards she came to me and said, "Oh, Professor, great talk, but in China, nothing is stable. Everything changes all the time." So that's sort of not just the language, but also the underpinning assumptions that are built into our theories and frameworks. It's really something we have to be reflexive about when we start applying them in very different kind of contexts.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, Evelina.
Hi Rob, my name is Nevelina Petrova. I work actually at RMIT Europe, which is based in Barcelona. So I was interested to see some of the examples that you gave also from the European context. And linked to that is also my question. How do you compare in a way the enabling environment, both in Europe versus in Australia, for setting up, but also maintaining and upscaling all those experiments in order to enable transformational change? And if that differs depending on the field, maybe what are the fields where you feel like Europe is maybe more advanced or more open to integrate this type of knowledge emerging from the experiments in the planning system, so to say, versus in Australia?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And Europe realized the benefit of being a country of countries where there's a Horizon framework and which has a history of engaging with more interdisciplinarity in its research approaches and so on. And then having also the funding schemes to be able to actually get that interdisciplinary research funded. So I think Europe is in a better position. If you just look, for instance, at some of the mission-based research programs that are going on around, let's say, the 100 climate neutral cities in Europe, that program. If you look at what's being funded, it's actually funding collaboration. As you probably are aware of. So it's actually funding collaboration, it's funding facilitation, it's funding stakeholder engagement. All of that stuff, which is it's not about the infrastructure, it's not about the technology. It's there as well, but we actually know the technology and the infrastructure. What you need to fund is the collaboration and the innovative enablers that gets to implementation and all that stuff. That I find much harder to make a case for in the Australian context, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Curious what you would say to your own question, though.
I might just take one more question. Can I just check, are there any online questions? No.
Thank you, that was a great talk. Based on your last response, what role do you think advocacy and lobbying plays in transitions?
Well, huge role, obviously. Like, this is also going to sort of the socio-political work that I talked about. And this is not a, like we often, maybe I should talk about I, not we, but initially I often thought about lobbying as something that you need to do in order to get whatever it is that you're lobbying for done, right? But the reality is, if you zoom out, there's an ecology of people and organizations that are lobbying for various, sometimes they agree with each other, sometimes they're lobbying for very different kind of futures. One of my current students, Alexander Nord, has been looking into sort of this ecology of intermediaries around the net zero transition in Australia. And that's, that's a very politicized place as well, where there are counter lobbies, but even within the lobby for net zero transitions, there are different emphases and different interests at play. So it's hugely important. It's absolutely there, but it's not a silver bullet to then get to an outcome that we want in terms of net zero transitions.
Okay, well, we might draw the session to a close at this point. Rob, I'd very much like to thank you for coming and visiting us today and giving your very insightful presentation on all of the work that you've done in this space and being so generous and sharing your knowledge, expertise and ideas with us today. So we now have some lunch available in the foyer there, so there's some further opportunity for conversations. Rob will be able to stay for a little while before he has to dash off, so if you'd like to speak to him directly, there'll be the opportunity to do so. I'd just like to mention there's another session in the Graduate Research Symposium this afternoon, which is on a kind of a related theme to this keynote about researching and engaging with communities as part of research led by David Kelly and Ellen Van Holstein from the Centre for Urban Research. So if anyone's interested in that, I think it's at 3 or 3:30. I can't remember exactly which time, but check the schedule. And look, lastly, I'd just like to thank the people who've helped organise today's session and the GRS overall: Anastasia Barker and Nicole Scott, Alan Shanks, and the team from the DSC College Operations team who've helped pull this all together. So thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy some lunch.